My name is Stephanie Thomas. In this presentation, we'll be discussing statistical analysis as evidence in employment discrimination litigation. Specifically, we'll talk about two alternative legal theories of discrimination: disparate treatment and disparate impact. We'll talk about direct versus indirect evidence in discrimination analysis. We'll talk about the basics of statistical inference. We'll talk about statistical significance and sample size. We'll also discuss the application of statistical inference to disparate impact and disparate treatment claims. We'll do some single pool analysis examples and look at the underlying assumptions, as well as a multiple pools analysis. And finally, we'll talk about the importance of statistics and a recent court decision, Randall versus Royce. There are two alternative legal theories we'll be discussing today. The first is disparate treatment. Disparate treatment is the intentional discrimination because of race, gender, age, or other protected group characteristic. Disparate treatment is the traditional discrimination that we think of. The other theory is disparate impact. Disparate impact is when a facially neutral policy or practice disproportionately screens out protected class members. One example of a disparate impact claim would be college degree requirements for employment, and we'll actually talk about that specific example a little bit later in the presentation. The form of the statistical analysis differs depending on which legal theory is involved. A disparate impact analysis is going to look different from a disparate treatment analysis. So the form of the statistical analysis presented really depends on the underlying legal theory involved. So let's talk about disparate treatment for a minute. With disparate treatment claims, the demonstration of intent is critical. The statistical evidence for a disparate treatment claim is more relevant in a class setting as opposed to an individual plaintiff setting. It's common to see disparate treatment analyses in a class setting. It's rare to see them in an individual single plaintiff kind of case. With a disparate treatment claim, the plaintiff's objective is to show that among similarly situated individuals, outcomes are adversely, statistically significantly correlated with membership in a protected group. And there's a lot of information in that statement. We'll talk about what similarly situated individuals means a little bit later, but basically you're looking at, within the individual's comparison group, who are you comparing those individuals to? And what the plaintiff's objective is to show that membership in a protected group, whether that be gender, whether that be race, age, disability, membership in that group is statistically significantly correlated with the adverse employment outcome. With disparate treatment claims, the analysis is often very complex because we need to capture the essence of what similarly situated means. So we can talk about multiple pools analysis where we're studying, several different comparison groups because of the way in which similarly situated needs to be defined. Unlike disparate treatment, in a disparate impact claim, intent is irrelevant. Motivation is not an issue here. For disparate impact claims, it's purely a statistical question. Did the challenged policy or practice have a disproportionate adverse impact on the protected group? If the answer to that question is yes, then the employer needs to demonstrate the validity of that practice. If there's no disproportionate adverse impact that's statistically significant, then the answer to that question is no, and that's usually the end of the story. If the statistical analysis doesn't reveal a a disproportionate adverse impact on the protected group, there's really nothing else to do from a statistical point of view. Typically, disparate impact analyses are going to be very straightforward statistical analyses. We do have the issue of the appropriate comparison group, but they're not going to be as complicated and unique as the disparate treatment claims. Disparate impact analyses typically are going to be very straightforward. Let's now talk about the basics of statistical inference. Let's make a wager. We're going to flip a coin 10 times. I pay you $1 for every tail, and you pay me $1 for every head. So I'm going to flip the coin, and let's say that I go behind a screen and flip the coin 10 times. I come back out from behind the screen, I tell you that I got 10 heads out of 10 flips, and I demand you pay me the $10. Your challenge is to figure out whether or not you've been cheated. What evidence do you have that you have been cheated or that you weren't cheated? Well, there's two kinds of evidence: direct evidence and indirect evidence. For direct evidence of cheating, there might be a security camera that videotaped me while I was behind the screen, and that footage shows that I lied. I told you I got 10, but I actually only got 6 heads. Another example of direct evidence would be a two-headed coin. If the coin was two-headed, then the only outcome can be heads, and you could examine the coin and look at both sides to determine that it was two-headed and conclude that I cheated you. We could also weigh the coin and see if it was equally weighted between heads and tails. If it turns out that the coin is weighted toward heads, again, that would be an example of direct evidence that I was cheating. But what if no direct evidence exists? What if we can't measure the coin? What if we can't look at both sides of it? What if there's no security footage? What do we do if there's no direct evidence? We can use indirect evidence. We know that the probability of a head on any flip of a fair coin is 50%. Out of 10 flips, we would expect 5 heads. Since there's a 50% chance of getting a head on any flip, we'd expect 50% of the time the coin to come up heads. So out of 10 flips, we would expect to get 10 heads. My reported result of 10 heads is 5 more than what we would expect. We would say that's a surplus of 5 heads. The question then becomes, is this disparity large enough to doubt that simple chance was the cause? To answer that question, we can look at the probability distribution. As we said before, in 10 flips, we would expect to see 5 heads. Now, more often than not, we're not going to get exactly 5 heads in 10 flips. Sometimes we'll get a little more than 5, sometimes we'll get a little less than 5, but we're going to expect that we're going to get heads 50% of the time. So then the question becomes, how likely is it that we would get 6 heads? Or 7 heads, or 8 heads, or 9 heads, or all 10 heads out of 10 flips? To answer this question, we can use probability. Now here we have a probability distribution, and in the first column we see the number of heads, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, and 4. The second column shows the probability of getting exactly that number of heads out of the number of flips. So for instance, the probability of getting exactly 10 heads is equal to 0.001. The probability of getting exactly 9 heads is 0.010. Now the third column shows the probability of getting at least as many heads. And that's really just a cumulative probability. So for example, the probability of getting 10 or more heads in 10 flips is 0.001. The probability of getting 9 or more heads is 0.011. The probability of getting 8 or more heads is 0.055, and so on. Now we're expecting to see 5 heads out of 10 flips. That's our expected result. Now what we can do is we can express the difference between what we actually see and what we expect to get in terms of something called standard deviation. And standard deviation is a statistical way of expressing differences in a normalized way. We're going to normalize it, and we're going to abstract from the units of the thing we're measuring. We're going to put it in standard terms. So you can see here in the last column, the probability of getting 10 heads is 3.10 units of standard deviation. The probability of getting 9 heads is 2.3 units. The probability of getting 8 heads is 1.6, and so forth. So we can express the number of heads that we're actually going to see in terms of how likely it is that we will see that effect. And what we're going to see in this example is over-repeated sampling. That is, we're going to flip the coin more and more and more times. We're going to repeat the experiment over and over and over again. What we're going to see, if we were to plot the number of heads that we get in each of these different experiments, we're going to see that those numbers are going to form a bell-shaped curve, and we call this the normal distribution. And the high point of that curve in the middle there is, in this example, going to be 5 heads, because that's the expected number based on a 50% chance of heads and a 50% chance of tails. And as we move away from that center mark, as we move to 8 heads, 9 heads, 10 heads, or as we move to 2 heads, 1 head, 0 heads, we're going to see that the likelihood of that outcome occurring by chance is going to be smaller and smaller and smaller. So for this example, the outcomes are going to follow the normal distribution. Now with the probability distribution, the deviations from the expected results can occur due to chance factors. It's possible that you weren't cheated. It could be the case that I really did in fact get 10 heads out of 10 flips. In fact, 10 heads is expected to occur once in every 1,000 games. The question we have to ask is whether or not the observed outcome is sufficiently rare to conclude that chance was not the likely explanation. The central issue here is, where do we draw the line? How many heads above 5 would I have to get for you to be comfortable in accusing me of cheating? How many is too many? Well, the Hazelwood School District versus U.S. decision said that a disparity of at least 2 or 3 standard deviations is statistically significant. So what inference can we draw from our little wager? The probability of getting 10 heads out of 10 flips with a fair coin is 1 out of 1,000, and that's equivalent to 3.1 units of standard deviation. This satisfies the Hazelwood threshold of 2 or 3 units. The difference between the actual and expected, in this case the 10 actual versus 5 expected, is said to be statistically significant. And what that means is you would reject the null hypothesis of a fair game, and you would accuse me of cheating because the disparity was statistically significant. Now it's important to know that no valid adverse inference can or should be drawn if the disparity is not statistically significant. I'm going to say that again. No valid adverse inference can or should be drawn if the disparity is not statistically significant. If a disparity is not statistically significant, it's statistically equivalent to 0. It doesn't matter how large the disparity is in terms of number of heads or number of people promoted or number of people hired. If the disparity isn't statistically significant, if it's not 2 or 3 units of standard deviation, it's not different from 0 from a statistical perspective. Now there's one more thing about statistical significance that I'd like to point out. Statistical significance is a function of the size of the disparity and of the number of things being studied. And to see this, let's look at the following example. We have here 2 different wagers. In the first wager, we're going to only do 10 flips of the coin. In the second wager, we're going to flip the coin 100 times. Okay? So let's start at the bottom, and let's say that in the 10 flip example, I get 6 heads out of 10 flips. That's equivalent to 0.31 units of standard deviation. Now the same 60% out of 100 flips, so this time I'm getting 60 heads out of 100 flips. That's equivalent to 1.9 units of standard deviation. So we can see that when we increased the number of flips from 10 to 100, we got a big difference in the statistical significance measure, even though the proportion of heads was the same. Now let's move up one row and let's look at 70%. So in the 10 flip example, I get 7 heads out of 10 flips. And that difference is equal to 0.95 units of standard deviation. That's not a statistically significant result. It doesn't meet that 2 or 3 unit threshold. So in a 10 flip game, if I got heads 70% of the time, you wouldn't think that that was caused by anything other than chance. However, if we'd look at the 100 flip game, and I still get 70% heads, so I get 70 heads out of 100 flips, that difference is 3.95 units of standard deviation, which does satisfy the Hazelwood threshold of 2 or 3 units. That difference is statistically significant, and we would infer in that case that you were in fact cheated. So we see the same percentage, 70%, whether it's 7 out of 10 or 70 out of 100, and we get different results, we get different measures of standard deviation, and we come to different conclusions. In the 10 flip game, you wouldn't conclude that you were cheated. In the 100 flip game, you would infer that you were cheated. So the number of things we're studying, the number of times we're flipping that coin, the sample size, has a really big impact on whether or not a result is going to be statistically significant. Statistical inference can be used to examine questions of employment discrimination. The application of that statistical inference is going to be different whether we're looking at disparate impact or disparate treatment claims. And remember before we said that the form of the analysis is really dependent on the type of claim. A disparate impact claim is going to require a different statistical analysis than a disparate treatment claim. So the application of statistical inference really is going to depend on the legal theory being advanced. So let's look at an example of a disparate impact claim. And let's look at an example analysis of hiring. Let's assume we have 1,000 applicants. 50% of them are white, and 50% of them are non-white. Out of those 1,000 applicants, we're going to make 200 hire events. And out of the 200 hires, 120 are white, and 80 are non-white. %50 of our applicants are non-white. Therefore, we expect that 50% of our hires would also be non-white. So 50% of 200 is 100. Now the non-white hiring shortfall is 20. It's the difference between the 100 hires that we would expect and the 80 actual non-white hires that were made. This difference is statistically significant at 3.09 units of standard deviation. Now, because that's a statistically significant result, some follow-up into that is needed. You want to try to find out what's causing that disparity between actual and expected non-white hires. And let's assume that your follow-up investigation reveals the following. One of the requirements for the position in question is a particular degree. Let's say it's a college degree, bachelor's degree. Whites are more likely to have this particular degree than non-whites. Therefore, non-whites are disproportionately screened out because of this degree requirement. The degree requirement has a disparate impact by race. So let's now repeat the analysis, looking only at the qualified applicants. So instead of looking at all applicants, we're only going to look at people who have the particular college degree we're looking for. And when we look at the qualified pool, our total number of applicants goes from 1,000 to 500. And of those 500 qualified applicants, 150 are non-white and 350 are white. So 30% of our qualified applicants are non-white. We would therefore expect 30% of our hire events to be non-white, or 60 non-white hires. In this case, we have a non-white hiring shortfall of -20. We would expect 60, we actually saw 80. So in this example, the hiring is actually favoring non-whites. There's a surplus. We hired more non-whites than we would have expected. Let's think about the results of these analyses for a minute. The analyses reveal the following. When we look at all applicants, we see there's a statistically significant shortfall of non-white hires. Now, this result could be used by a plaintiff to demonstrate a prima facie case of disparate impact on the use of the college degree as a requirement for hiring. That degree requirement has a disparate impact. When we look at the qualified applicants, so we're removing all the people who don't have that degree, and we're only going to look at those who do, we see that there's actually a surplus of non-white hires among the qualified applicants. So, from a defendant's perspective, the business necessity and the job relatedness, if you will, of this degree requirement for this particular position needs to be established. Let's now turn to an example of a disparate treatment claim. Let's assume that we have a group of females who are alleging that they're being denied promotion opportunities. And let's say that we have 100 employees who are eligible to be promoted. 50% male, 50% female. And assume that we're making 200 promotions. And of those 200 promotions, 120 go to males and 80 go to females. Now, since 50% of the employees are female, we would expect 50% of the promotions to be female. We would expect 100 female promotions. The female promotion shortfall in this case is going to be 20. It's the 100 expected promotions minus the 80 actual promotions. And this difference is statistically significant at 3.09 units of standard deviation. But let's think about the assumptions in this example for just a minute. The first assumption is that all 1,000 employees are competing against one another for the promotion. It also assumes that qualification factors are identically distributed by gender. So there's going to be no difference in the qualifications between men and women in this group. And this is the broadest possible view of similarly situated. And what we mean by similarly situated is employees whose positions require the same skills and abilities, they have the same levels of responsibility within the organization, their jobs that they perform have similar value within the organization, they're the appropriate people to be compared against one another. Now, because we're assuming identical distribution of qualification factors, we're assuming one giant pool here, and everyone in that pool has an equal likelihood of being promoted. Well, what if we were to change that assumption? What if we were to assume, instead of one large pool of all 1,000 employees, what would happen if those employees were in two different departments? So let's assume we have 500 employees in Department A and 500 employees in Department B. And within Department A, females are 30% of the population, and they're 70% of the population in Department B. So for Department A, we're making 150 promotion events. We would expect 30% of them to be female. So we would expect 45 female promotions in Department A. Let's further assume that 45 females actually were promoted. In that case, the female promotion surplus would be equal to 0. Now within Department B, we're making 50 promotions, and we would expect 70%, or 35, to be females. We actually see 35 females being promoted. So again, the female surplus is equal to 0. When we look at all employees together, we have a female promotion shortfall of 20, but when we look at it by department, we're in perfect parity. The actual female promotions is equal to the expected female promotions. This is an example of a multiple pools analysis. And in a multiple pools analysis, employees aren't competing with one another all across the board. Each employee is only competing with others in her pool. So an individual in Department A is only competing with other Department A individuals for that promotion. Somebody in Department B is only competing with other Department B employees for that promotion. And when we control for department, we see gender parity. There's no difference between actual and expected when we only compare people within their department. Now for a multiple pools analysis, the pools can be anything. They can be job, they can be pay grade, they could be department, they could be location. Whatever's going to differentiate one group of employees from another. However, the pools have to be justified. There's got to be some underlying business reason or logic for constructing the pools in the way you did. You can't just arbitrarily select what your pools are going to be. Ideally, for a promotion case, you'd want to construct the pools along the same lines as the decision-making process. If employees in a particular pay grade are competing against one another for promotion events, then pay grade would be the logical choice for the pool. If people in the same department were competing for promotions, then obviously the pool you'd want to structure the pool based along department lines. The pools can be anything that mirrors the decision-making process, but the pools have to be justified. Now here's another example of a multiple pools analysis. And this is sort of the flip side of the example we saw previously. Here, when we look at everybody all together, we're looking cross-department. We have 1,000 employees. Females are 50%. We're making 200 promotion events. We would expect 50% of 200 to be female promotions. The actual number of female promotions is 100. So the actual is exactly equal to the expected. So there's no female surplus or shortfall of promotion events when we consider everybody all together. However, If we break people out into their department, we see a different result. Assume that there's 240 people in Department A, and 83% of those people are female. We're making 130 promotions within Department A, so we would expect 83%, or 108, of those promotions to be female. We actually see that 90 females were promoted. So in this case, we have a female promotion shortfall of 18, and that's the difference between the 108 expected and the 90 actual. We see a similar thing if we look at Department B employees. We have 760 employees in Department B, 40% of whom are female. We make 70 promotions within Department B, and we would expect 40% of those, or 28, to be female. We actually promoted 10 females. So again, we have a female promotion shortfall of 18, the difference between 28 and 10. The point of this example is to show that multiple pools analysis doesn't guarantee a good statistical outcome. In the first example, we saw that when we controlled for department, we no longer had a female promotion shortfall. In this example, we have no promotion shortfall overall, but when we control for department, we end up with a female shortfall of promotions. The other lesson to be learned from this example is that a good result from a simple model can be misleading. By comparing everybody all together and using a very simple model, you can really obscure what's going on in the layers of the organization. So it's really important that whatever statistical analysis you set up, the structure of that analysis needs to reflect the actual decision-making process the organization uses. I'd like to make one final point about the application of statistical inference in employment discrimination claims. It's important to remember that statistical analysis can never prove discrimination. We can only say that the inferences drawn from our statistical analysis either are or are not consistent with the hypothesis of discrimination. Statistics can never be used to prove discrimination. At this point, you may be thinking to yourself, "This is all very interesting, Dr. Thomas, but who cares? How is this relevant to my law practice?" I'm here to tell you that statistics are important, and to highlight that, we'll talk about a recent decision, Randall versus Rolls-Royce. Sally Randall and Rona Pepmeyer were high-level female managers at Rolls-Royce's Indianapolis facility, which was formerly known as Allison Engine Company. Ms. Randall and Ms. Pepmeyer claimed they were paid less than their male counterparts, they were passed over for promotions, and they witnessed male executives putting down women. The plaintiffs were seeking class certification. In March of 2010, the Honorable Sarah Evans Barker of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Indiana denied certification of a putative gender discrimination class claim in Randall versus Rolls-Royce. Judge Barker's decision is interesting because of its thorough analysis of competing statistical evidence before the court. The decision highlights the importance of powerful expert reports and expert testimony in class actions. Judge Barker's decision turned largely on her resolution of competing statistical evidence offered by each party's expert. Unlike some other judges who've been reluctant to delve too deeply into expert testimony, her opinion explained at the outset, if there is a dispute as to the value or applicability or efficacy of either side's expert statistical analysis, the way in which that dispute is resolved impacts both the underlying systemic discrimination claim and the determination of whether a viable class action exists. In her decision, Judge Barker acknowledged that the commonality requirement of Rule 23A for class certification is a relatively low hurdle. She concluded that the requirement was not met here, in this case, primarily because the plaintiff's expert's statistical analysis was not convincing. This is partly because of variables that the plaintiff's expert failed to account for in its analysis, and its questionable definition of the relevant pool of employees to study. Judge Barker concluded that the defendant's expert has, in our view, convincingly demonstrated that there is no common gender effect across the putative class. The court credited the defendant's expert's approach to defining the relevant population for analysis and the unique studies of the varying gender effects in compensation observed across different salary grade levels, business units, and time periods. Judge Barker's decision goes on to also discuss, in detail, the statistical evidence relating to the typicality requirement of Federal Rule 23A. Similar to her findings with commonality, she adopted the conclusions of the defendant's expert as substantially more convincing than the less substantially complete analysis of the plaintiff's expert. Throughout the Randall decision, the significance of careful attention to expert reports and expert testimony in discrimination class actions is evident. The court's favorable view of the defendant's expert analyses demonstrates the benefits of close collaboration between counsel as the masters of factual record and relevant legal principles and statistical experts. This collaboration ensures that the statistical models are tracking the actual decision-making processes at issue and that those analyses are aligned with the relevant legal inquiries under Rule 23. Attorneys with an understanding of statistical analyses and the inferences drawn from these analyses are better positioned to advise their clients on the merits of the matter and are more effective during the pretrial preparation phase of the case. Basic quantitative skills allow the attorney to understand the analyses that will be appropriate for the matter at hand, speculate about what statistical analyses might be presented by opposing counsel, and anticipate potential attacks on the statistical analyses she presents. All of these lead to a more effective presentation at trial. A basic familiarity with common statistical concepts and techniques, as applied to the law environment, allows attorneys to better serve their clients and to participate in meaningful discussions with their experts. To sum up our discussion, we talked about two alternative legal theories of discrimination: disparate treatment and disparate impact. Disparate treatment is the intentional discrimination because of race, gender, age, or other protected characteristic. With disparate treatment, the demonstration of intent is critical. Statistical analysis is more appropriate in a class setting as opposed to an individual plaintiff setting. The statistical analysis of disparate treatment is often complex in order to capture the essence of similarly situated employees. Disparate impact, on the other hand, is when a facially neutral policy or practice disproportionately screens out protected class members. With disparate impact, intent is irrelevant. It's purely a statistical question. And typically, these statistical analyses are very straightforward. The type of analysis used depends on the type of legal theory being advanced. We also talked about the basics of statistical inference. There's 3 steps to every comparative statistical study. 1. Determine the expected outcome from the challenged process for the protected class, assuming no discrimination. 2. Compare the expected and actual outcomes to calculate a disparity measure. And 3. Assess the statistical significance of disparity. An outcome is said to be statistically significant if the disparity is equal to 2 or 3 units of standard deviation or more. It's important to remember that statistical significance is a function of both the size of the disparity and the number of things being studied. The key point to remember with statistical significance is that no valid adverse inference can or should be drawn if the disparity is not statistically significant. A disparity that's not statistically significant is statistically equivalent to 0. We also looked at 2 examples of statistical analysis. The first was a hiring example with respect to disparate impact. The second analysis was a promotions example in which a disparate treatment claim was advanced. We saw how changing the assumptions changes the results of the analysis. In our promotions example, we drew different inferences when we grouped employees together in one large pool and when we controlled for department. It's important to remember that the statistical analysis should as closely resemble the actual decision-making process as possible. Finally, we talked about the importance of statistics. In Judge Barker's decision, she performed a thorough analysis of competing statistical evidence. Her decision highlights the importance of powerful expert reports and expert testimony in employment litigation. Statistical analysis is important. A basic familiarity with common statistical concepts and techniques, as applied to law, will allow attorneys to better serve their clients and to participate in meaningful discussions with their experts.